Welcome to the second lecture in our series Music Under Stalin, where we are going to ask the most crucial question, in my view: how can music be socialist realist? And I've chosen this painting for you, which to me very much represents socialist realism. It's a sports parade. It's by Yuri Pimenov. And you can say, just by looking at it, well, we know what socialist realism sounds like. It sounds like this. So this is the refrain that they're singing. I don't know another country where one can breathe as freely as here. Something that sounds quite ironic when you think that this is a song written in 1936, so just before the huge wave of repression and mass arrests and mass murder, which was followed then by the war, and then another wave of repression, slightly smaller one, and which was preceded by a less visible way of repression. So there is this lie at the core of socialist realism. It's supposed to act as a veneer, as a beautiful, joyful veneer for something that is not that at all. And that is quite tragic, and I don't think we should forget about it, and that's why I will be sometimes talking about various biographies of the people that we're going to quote from. When I talk about socialist realism in music, to me it's completely uncontroversial that it's an important topic, but I'm always challenged on this, so I've listed these challenges, and I thought I'll get rid of them straight away. So people say, well, wasn't socialist realism just a power game? It's not a coherent aesthetic. It's something that one official say, well, I think it's socialist realist, and another one will say, well, I don't think it is. And you can basically pick and choose. The rules are quite arbitrary. And, well, there is that side to it. But at the same time, having been born in the Soviet Union, I just feel like I know what socialist realism is. I can recognize it when I go to a metro station or when I go to hear some music. I just know it. It's not just an aesthetic, something nebulous. It's also a style. Other people say, well, why denigrate perfectly nice pieces of music by using this label? And this was a charge leveled at me by one of my colleagues from Russia who was absolutely appalled that I called Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony socialist realist. And because she likes it. Well, I like it too, but I think, that socialist realism is somewhere in the background still. He at least attempted to be socialist realist, and maybe he didn't quite succeed, but there was something in the back of his mind, because it was a forced aesthetic that everyone had to adhere to. And so I imagine it as a kind of quilting point. Yeah, if you imagine the quilted sofa or something like that, and you spill breadcrumbs on it, the breadcrumbs are going to end up in that quilting point. So if socialist realism is a quilting point and you write lots of music around it, somehow it's important that point is there. Yeah, so even if we can imagine that in the West, there would have been music that sounds very very similar to music written in the Soviet Union. So why design this special label for something that was written in the Soviet Union? And indeed, I don't know, recently listened to Arthur Bliss's piano concerto, and that could have won a Stalin Prize. Yeah, some music by Aaron Copland sounds very socialist realist to me. Yeah, so there are examples. But I would argue that even every single note is the same, but one piece was written in the Soviet Union and another one, say, in the United States, they will be different, because there is that context, yeah, because there is that forced element of it, of this aesthetic that people had to adhere to. And finally, there is this new thing that is happening at the moment in Russia. And I wanted to spend 2 minutes talking about this because I'm very passionate about this issue. There is this new thing, let's forget socialist realism like a bad dream. I went to an exhibition when I was in Moscow just a few weeks ago, and of this wonderful painter, Yuri Pimenov, whose paintings are already presented on many occasions here. And this is one of his most famous ones. I think it's a fantastic painting. It's about the steel industry. It's from 1927. It's kind of expressionist and constructivist. When you see it face to face with it, it's just stunning, absolutely stunning colors, such dynamism and power from it. Then in the 30s, he changes his style completely, and this is his famous, very famous, I like it too, it's in the style of French Impressionists, there's a bit of after the rain feeling, slightly kind of wet canvas. And it's New Moscow, that was also became very popular, won some prize, but it's a completely different style. And then it gets even worse. And in the 50s, it's just, he starts doing absolutely awful things, which are not even impressionist. And you would think, going to the exhibition, that it would be explained to you. But there's no explanation. And then I wasn't going to buy a catalog, but I went to the shop and I photographed a bit of the catalog and translated it for you. And my goodness me. Yeah, so this is about the change of style. Were the reasons for this turnaround entirely personal? Perhaps not. We should keep in mind various new aesthetic trends, the zeitgeist, the unavoidable arrival and establishment of alternative ideas, which no artist could ignore. It has been observed that artistic developments in Russia coincided on the whole with developments in European culture. For the artist tuning in to a new sensibility, which is in the air, and transforming it into an image is an imperative beyond explanation, something that is almost irrational. Well, that really made me sick. I actually had to go straight home. I couldn't do anything else. I was so fuming. I was ashamed, for people who created this. This is a theoretical gallery, and apparently they're must be following some kind of new ideological directions that we have to kind of just forget about it. There was not a word Stalin or Soviet in this exhibition. It was just a free artist who changed his style at will, because there was something in the air. Now, what was in the air? For example, he was declared a formalist. He lost his income. He couldn't feed his family. He was very worried about that, so he changed his style. So it's a little bit different. So this is why I'm going to be talking about socialist realism, and I think it's very important to understand the art of that time. Okay, so rant over. This was my introduction. And now we are going to talk about the history of the term socialist realism. So Marxists usually supported art that was realist in some way, although Marx didn't really write anything on aesthetics, and Engels did write very little. And usually it's this quote from his letter to Margaret Harkness that is being quoted. Realism, to my mind, implies, besides truth of detail, the truthful reproduction of typical characters under typical circumstances. This will come up again. Anyway, there was a kind of theory made out of this. And Lenin added also to this the notion that since human consciousness reflects the material world, art should do likewise. Rather than offering an escape from the world, it should create this reflection, an image in your mind. His model of literary realism was Tolstoy. For Engels, it was Balzac. For Lunacharsky, who was a Bolshevik and then became the first commissar for the Enlightenment, it was Maxim Gorky who was the paragon of realism. And he was the person who started coming up with these labels: proletarian realism in 1906, social realism in 1907, new social realism in the 20s, talking about visual arts, not music. And but actually the term, I was trying to look really for the latest research, and it seems that the term socialist realism is Stalin's own term, and that it emerged somewhere in May 1932 in a conversation with Ivan Gronsky, who was put in charge of basically bringing all the writers into the same union, because they were fighting before that. There were various factions, and he was put in charge of this unification. And why is it not socialist? It has to be socialist and not the other things that Gronsky suggested to him, as he tells us, not proletarian and not communist. Yeah, so it couldn't be proletarian because Stalin was at that point fighting the proletarian faction of the writers, yeah, because they created this very restrictive set of rules, and a lot of good writers just didn't want to participate in this. And Stalin, of course, was himself a poet, a literary critic. He really understood something about it. That's why we're talking about literature at this point. Anyway, why not communist? Because communist realism, he says, communism is too far in the future, and also it might bring people to think of the world revolution, which was Trotsky's concept. So again, politically not an expedient term. We are now building socialism in one single country, and we're going to call it socialist realism. So Gronsky, this is the first time the term is published. Gronsky says we must pose the problem of method, but not in an abstract manner. It's not that a writer has to pass a course in dialectical materialism first before he can write. Our principal demand is that the writers write the truth and truthfully reflect our reality, which is itself dialectical. Therefore, the main method of Soviet literature is the method of socialist realism. Yeah, so despite Gronsky being quite important at that time, everyone understands that for somebody to tell you what the main method is, he has to be the mouthpiece of Stalin. Yeah, so this is the official line. Although the term is officially promulgated as the aesthetic doctrine for the Soviet Union only in August 1934 at the first Congress of Socialist Writers. But what about music? Yeah, what are we going to do with music? Straight away, in various meetings of musicians, this term was discussed. Yeah, because if it has to be our aesthetic doctrine as well, we have to decide what it means. So there was a number of articles published in 33 and 34 to discuss this issue. And I would like to quote in particular from one of them, and this is quite an interesting person who wrote it, a thesis on socialist realism and music. Bolesław Przybyszewski, who was a Pole, as you can guess from the name, who was interned during the First World War and exiled to Siberia. That was his first arrest. Then in 1933, after he wrote his thesis, he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years of gulag camps for homosexuality. So he went to Siberia, served his sentence, did not come back, decided to stay there as a volunteer working for the theater, was then rearrested, brought to Moscow, sentenced for treason this time, and executed in 1937. So this is just the kind of for the background of people who are participating in this. But he was actually, despite being known as the director of the Moscow Conservatoire during the proletarianist times, when it was a very restrictive institutions, I think he actually may have saved the institution rather than destroyed it during those years. And he was, I think, a true intellectual who tried to engage with these issues seriously. Because if you write, if you read somebody else writing on socialist realism at that time, sometimes it's just words spinning. It doesn't mean anything. So I think that here there are some useful things that we can get from it. So the first thing, he talks about socialist realism in a pragmatic way, as a style and not just a method. So that was useful. The composers pricked their ears. What should we do? And then he says that the obvious thing, but needed to be said, in comparison with realism in literature and the other arts, music is greatly restricted in its ability to represent reality. So it represents types, the typical, rather than concrete unique phenomena. And everyone said, phew, we don't have to portray those particular minds in the Donbass. We can do something more general and vague. So then he says that, socialist realist music must be programmatic in the broadest sense of the word. So you can portray struggle in general, but not necessarily a struggle of a particular Red Army division on a particular front, and so on, which is what people were doing. For example, there was a Shostakovich's professor, Maximilian Steinberg, who at that point wrote a symphony which was called Turksip, which was the railway from Central Asia to Siberia. So it was supposed to represent that particular railway. And so there are a lot of very, very concrete, detailed textual references in the music that was written at that time. So in this way, it seemed like socialist realism was actually broadening the number of opportunities compared to the previous period. So it was seen as a good thing. So he comes up also with the idea of musical image. So if our consciousness reflects material reality, it reflects it in images. So we have a musical image, which is a kind of in the middle between reality itself and the music. So this is where we can verbalize music, and we can say this is where the content resides, in this musical image, the image of struggle. So the music itself gives us a march, gives us dotted rhythms, gives us trumpet fanfares. The image is struggle, then the reality could be, something much more concrete, and so on. So you can see how this works. I mean, it's a little bit of, I suppose, kind of word acrobatics, but nevertheless, you can see how you are getting into what to actually do with this. He also calls to study the realist music of the past. And the good thing was that the realist music of the past included almost everything, apart from church music and the recent bourgeois modernism. So he was not so sure about things starting from Debussy and Stravinsky, these kind of things. But he called everything, it was naive realism, dynamic realism, static realism, came up with all these labels, and basically it opened up a wealth of possibilities of what models you could use from the past, which again, as I told you last time, was severely restricted by the proletarianist ideologues. And one more, and this is very interesting and very important for what we are going to hear today as well. He includes folk music and folk-based art music in the category of the most obvious realism, just next to things that are onomatopoeic, just represent sounds, or things that are kind of symbolic, like the ring in Wagner, or the sword, or something like that. And next to that is folk music, because it represents the people in the most direct way. And that is great, because whenever you write something on folk tunes, your music is realist. That's fantastic. So that was developed then further. There's another article by Roman Gruber, who was a musicologist, who suggests that this Engels' idea of the typical in realism can also be applied to music, and that the most typical melodies that we may perceive as banal, for example, something from a Bizet opera or Verdi opera or Schubert's serenade, are actually realist. So that's great as well. We can hope that we can create this very accessible art through the music that might sound conservative and banal, but actually for that very reason, it is realist. And another thing that he suggested, that we should not shun pure abstract music, music without the title. We shouldn't shun symphonies and concertos that don't necessarily reflect the Soviet reality directly, because he suggested this kind of music can potentially be more useful as it conveys class ideology to the listener in a more subtle way, kind of inculcated in the listener. So I think that was already giving you a very good recipe of what kind of music you need to write. But then comes the first Congress of Soviet Writers, and of course everyone, it was a huge event, there was a lot of foreign guests, and everyone was listening to the speeches and reading the speeches. And the most useful sound bites came from Andrei Zhdanov's speech, which was a political speech. He was a party representative in charge of the arts. And these are the things that he mentioned in his speech. So that subject matter, images, and language have to be derived from contemporary Soviet life. That's not so easy for music, but I suppose you can start imagining what you would do here. Literature, he's talking about literature again, should be optimistic in essence as belonging to the progressive class. Yes, since it belongs to the progressive class, things are going to resolve and be great in the end. Yeah, so you have this great shining ending. Whatever is bad right now, whatever you're portraying in your realism, there might be some negative features, but you have to have in mind this shining future. You're already thinking, in terms of music, it means the optimistic ending in the major. Yeah, that's what it really means. So not objective reality, but reality in its revolutionary development. Yeah, so reality as we, class-conscious proletarian writers or composers, want it to be. Yeah, so maybe not quite realism then. He says that you shouldn't be afraid of the charge of being tendentious. Whatever you're doing is always going to be political. And he also said that we shouldn't abandon revolutionary romanticism. Oh, great, romanticism can be part of realism as well. Yeah, talking about supreme spirit of heroic deeds and magnificent future prospects. So thinking of music, you will think, oh, okay, so the orchestration is going to be big, it's going to be monumental, yeah, there's going to be a lot of choir. What else? Yeah, it's going to be all sort of shiny. Another important point, the technique and skill are very important. Yeah, so you have to study. It's a complete turnaround compared to the previous period. Yeah, when people are saying, well, you have to study Lenin and Stalin and dialectical materialism, and somehow then you will learn to write music in the correct way. Well, no. Yeah, you actually have to study harmony and counterpoint again. Yeah, to become a good composer. So, and finally, yeah, there's a need to select all the best that has been created in the sphere by all previous epochs. Yeah, so all the past is suddenly opened. Yeah, we inherited all these things. We don't just call them, dismiss them as bourgeois. We actually want to use these things in the best possible way. And this is why in the visual arts and in architecture, you find these incredibly eclectic conflations of different styles. And I wanted to give you a few examples. Well, this, of course, is a building that was never built in Moscow. This is the famous Palace of Soviets as envisioned in 1932. There was many proposals for it. And you can see at the back there's the Moscow University, which is already envisioned, but it hadn't been built yet. And the Kremlin is completely dwarfed by this huge, absolutely huge thing, which might remind you of the Lighthouse of Alexandria or something like that. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of references in that building. Actually, this time being in Moscow, I felt very much that I'm still living in the Stalinist city of these broad streets, yeah, and a lot of greenery and things like that, something that's been designed as a city of the future. It's very, very obvious, and even more obvious than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Things like this, when you travel on the river and you're on the canals and you envision these locks, and suddenly you're into some Italian Renaissance Italy or something like that. There might be a Roman style or Florentine style. I mean, why would you put on a dam, something with these arches? Well, this explains to you that you should take the best from the past, from different periods of the past. But of course, things like this, which are very inspirational. Yeah, this is from the metro. Mayakovskaya station, if you look up, and yeah, you're underground, but you actually see the sky. So there's a lot of blue sky, a lot of technology, airplanes, sport that is represented also in this very heroic way of actually people flying. Of course, socialist realism visually changes as well and gradually kind of becomes more sedate. And there's a lot of folk motifs that are coming in. And originally there might be sort of quite a geometrical things that are playing in. But within these geometrical shapes, there are also representation of very different nationalities of the Soviet Union, yeah, and they're all usually playing musical instruments and dancing, yes, which is very typical. And then the later you go, the more ridiculous it becomes, and it's a completely bizarre combination with, Trajan's columns or something like that, actually made of crystal, and this medieval chandelier, and that's in Leningrad. And that came right after Stalin's death, when the aesthetic was changed, and they decided this was too luxurious. So they built some of the columns in crystal, and then the rest of them were just in marble. So they downgraded them. In painting, this I think is a kind of narrative painting, which is typical of socialist realism. So obviously Stalin and Voroshilov, it's just been raining, but the sky is about to break open, the clouds are about to part. There is this sense of the future. There's the sense that the Moscow is being built. You can see the more recent kind of Soviet building there with the flag. It's not actually, can't be seen from that point. Well, that's revolutionary romanticism. So it's not necessarily representing reality literally, literalistically, but in its revolutionary development. That's why we can move that building here so that we can see it from this point. So now what about sort of musical socialist realism? Nobody has given a list like this. This is my own list. This is something that just comes from thinking about it, how people would have translated Zhdanov's points into music. So it meant using conservative forms, eclectic styles. Romantics and Russian classics were safe models with a bit of modernization, but not too much. Possibly neoclassicism, but not so that it sounds too much like Hindemith or Stravinsky. So something that is more classical than modernist, or maybe not so much neoclassical as classical. Optimistic endings, of course. Interesting thing, also very important for what we're going to hear at the end, virtuosity. Especially concerto. It becomes a very typical form of Soviet music because you have this uplift at the end when you have something virtuosic being played. You have this sense of that it's a life-affirming piece. That becomes a very popular and safe genre to use as well. Folk materials, again, as long as they're not presented in the modernist way. So not Stravinsky, not Bartok, but more kind of Rimsky-Korsakov and his students. Organic development rather than montage. So this is how quality is presented in the music. So music has to develop like a tree, grow without seams. It's not like, you use sort of plonk one mass song in there and then another one, and that's all kind of rough and ready. No, it has to be actually sort of properly developed, like the Germans taught us in the 19th century, and so on and so forth. And very importantly, the presence of a narrative. Just like in paintings, there's always narrative. You can always tell a story about a socialist realist painting. You should be able to tell a story about a work, even if it's just called a symphony. And who makes up the story? Sometimes the composer himself or herself would put a few lines that would set your mind working in a certain direction. Sometimes it would be a musicologist or a critic that would propose that. And interestingly, composers who were not naturally narrative, like Prokofiev, I think, is not really a narrative composer, did have trouble fitting in with this requirement. So now we're going to finally talk about music and about a few models that were at that time, very early on, 32, 33, talked about as potentially proto-socialist realists and potentially, maybe not completely 100% good yet, but on the right path. So Lev Knipper, you probably haven't heard of him, but you know some of his music, I'm sure, as you'll find out in a moment. So the symphony that was talked about much was actually Symphony Number 3, but there isn't even a recording of it, so I'll have to switch it with Symphony Number 4, but worry not, it's exactly the same kind of thing. It also has a mass song in it, and it has this very kind of straightforward selection of sections with strong contrasts. The most important feature of it is that he uses his own song. And that song you're going to hear and recognize in a moment.
Polska szeroka polje, jedą ty po polu geroi, jak ta krasnej armii geroi. Jedą ty po polu geroi, jak ta krasnej armii geroi.
You know it, don't you? Yes. So very simple harmony, 3 chords basically. I think the proletarianist composers could have done that, yeah, without much learning. So very, very simple harmony. And it's not like, it's in the style of these soldier songs that Knipe would have known very much, because during the Civil War, he was actually fighting in the Civil War on the side of the whites, yeah, unexpectedly. Very interesting character. Just tell you a few things about his biography. I mean, you can see he is a very cool-looking guy. He was an exceptionally cool guy. He was a secret spy, secret agent. He spoke German freely because of his roots. You know, he traveled between the West and the Soviet Union. During the war, he was trying to organize Hitler's assassination. And nobody knew about this in the Composers Union. Yeah, they just knew him as somebody who wrote these songs and symphonies about the Red Army. He was very so closely connected to the Red Army. So this is, it's not actually, you know, there's a book about it which you can read. So it's all true, because his sister was Olga Chekhova, who was a German actress, so she could actually arrange for him access to Hitler. So it's actually a true story, absolutely extraordinary. Let's hear how this song sounds in the symphony.
Мамкам мы рукой махнули, только бы девкам и сказали, да подождите, не горюйте.
This music, yeah, which was very much at the time praised, eventually started seeming a bit primitive. Yeah, so the quality aspect of it, the organic development type, yeah, he was a bit low on this. So this is why I'm saying this is very much early on, yeah, in the Socialist Realist period. And that type of most sort of direct references to Soviet life, such as the poem of the Komsomol fighter, is supposed to be, yeah, actually having sung text in the symphony, slightly starts going away in the next few years. But if you're in 1933, every symphony has a text, every symphony has a chorus. So they could have actually stayed with that. I mean, the fact that you then move on to the next stage, where suddenly you can write a symphony without a text, without a chorus, and say that there's still music that is Soviet and Socialist Realist, is actually wouldn't have necessarily happened if all this word spinning hadn't been done. And so it's kind of important to justify that kind of thing. So here we come to the next example, and the next example is precisely this Symphony Number 12 by Nikolai Miskovsky, which was actually written in 1931, so well before Socialist Realism was even named. But nevertheless, it turned out to be a very important point, a very important landmark. So at that time, Miskovsky was still working at the Conservatoire, but basically almost not able to work. He went on leave because he just couldn't tolerate this proletarianist composers misbehaving there. And most of them were his students. And one of these students was Marian Kaval. And we have this wonderful note that Kaval sent him during one of the meetings, suggesting to Miskovsky the kind of symphony he wants to write. So, Enya, what would you think of a topic like this for your symphony? Sowing the seed. The new men come out to fight nature, not just as individuals, but now as a collective, and their attitude to nature is also different. You could build a symphony out of this, from the sufferings of endless toil through to a joyful and inspired collective construction. This, in my opinion, is a great topic. Yeah, so this Marian Kaval, who didn't even attend his classes, tells him what to do. And Miskovsky has to say, yes, I'll do this reluctantly. But then Kaval, of course, empowered, as a cultural commissar, writes him a long letter when he describes this symphony and what he should and shouldn't do, and how he should educate himself and read Stalin and Lenin, and dialectical materialism, and all the mistakes, ideological mistakes he is likely to make. He actually sort of lays it all out and suggests a few texts that he should use. And Miskovsky basically does none of this. He pretends that he received this letter too late and already completed the symphony. So the symphony doesn't have a text, doesn't have a title, doesn't have a choir. It's just a 3-movement symphony, number 12. But because there was this backstory, the backstory was publicized. So the symphony was premiered as agricultural symphony or collective farm symphony. So there was this phantom program flying around it, floating. Nobody, and people started, hearing various things. But the only thing that you can really put your finger on is this narrative, musical narrative, very abstract one, that comes through these 3 movements. And I'm going to show to you how it's done. So it starts, and we can imagine this is not collectivized Russia yet. So somebody is coming out into the field and very lonely, in a lonely way, singing a song, a sad song about how things are terrible. So then in the second movement, you have more action, and everyone felt there was some kind of struggle. There was struggle for collectivization going on. All the kulaks were arrested and sent to Siberia, and lots of them were killed. So apparently this is what people heard in this music. In the finale, of course, you will have to have the very different, very joyful tone, to represent the victory of collectivized labor. then at the end you will need to have an optimistic ending, so I'll just play you the very end of it. So that's emphatic enough. Now, how did Miskovsky feel about all this? He was slightly embarrassed about the symphony. He actually confessed in one of the letters that he considered his finale came out a bit vulgar. Yeah, so it was something that he wouldn't necessarily do himself. Yeah, something that he felt forced to do. He didn't really want to promote his symphony quite so much. But it was promoted for him, and people were writing this very detailed explanation of how we move from non-collectivized agriculture to collectivized agriculture. Yeah, so that actually harmed the symphony a little bit, because then people started saying, well, we don't think that's represented well enough, we don't think that content is reflected in quite the right style of music. Yeah, so you can see that it's much safer for composers to say less, yeah, or to say almost nothing. And for musicologists also to be very clever and provide only the slightest pointers, yeah, so that you don't let down the composer. And this is exactly what is going to happen in the next years and decades, and this is what we are going to talk about in the next lectures, when Shostakovich starts writing his symphonies without titles, yeah, and which have some kind of narrative strategy, and there might be a phrase, this or that phrase about it. For example, it could be a symphony about Soviet youth, and then imagine what you like. So these phantom programs, I think, this verbalization of musical content that happens somewhere on the pages of the press or in a program note is very important for creating this link, yeah, of music with reality. So you can, I guess, claim that realism is not so much in the music itself as in the commentary around it, but that's one way of thinking about it. So, and the third example that I'm going to give is the violin concerto by Khachaturian. Yeah, I'm going to say it the Russian way. Yeah, Aram Khachaturian as opposed to Khachaturian or something. It's easier for me. So Khachaturian, violin concerto from 1940, became this very important piece. One of the first Stalin prizes was awarded this. And several things came together here, because Khachaturian, of course, was kind of classified as a national composer. He had an Armenian name, he was Armenian by birth, but he wasn't actually from Armenia, he was from Tbilisi. He grew up in Tbilisi in Georgia, and then went to Moscow, was educated in Moscow. And he started writing in this almost Russian Orientalist style at first. Yeah, his music was influenced by Rimsky-Korsakov. You will hear a little bit of Scheherazade later on when our musicians are going to play his trio. And he used also folk music from different regions of the Soviet Union. So it wasn't necessarily just the expression of the Armenian nationality, but it could be a mixture, kind of friendship of the peoples. But because he was writing in this style, it was seen as, again, realist music. Yeah, so the moment you introduce the folk tunes, even if the folk tunes are not actually real, because very often Khachaturian just invented them. And yet he was also, had this great temperament and great desire to write music that was in the major, very life-affirming. And then couple that with David Oistrakh, who I would claim was a kind of poster boy of Soviet type of performance, yeah, maybe socialist realist style of performance. So somebody who would perform, if you wake him up at night, he would be just as reliable, always note perfect. Also, emotion that is very communicative, that carries through. Not anybody who could be nervous, yeah, or kind of, mystical in his interpretation. So something, yeah, that was considered to be a Soviet style of performance. So you couple Khachaturian with Oistrakh and you get this absolutely fail-safe recipe. So let's hear a little bit of the finale. The problem with that then Khachaturian was absolutely wedded to this style. He couldn't change his style anymore. He tried to do that in the 40s. He tried to do something more ambitious, something that wasn't based on folk tunes, and it was completely rejected. Yeah, he was declared formalist and suffered all kinds of criticism, suffered a lot of health trouble after that, and basically decided not to bother anymore, yeah, and come back to this folk style. So that's again, you are going to hear his very early piece, a student piece, his trio that our musicians are going to play, where the style is kind of natural. This is what he comes out with, how he finds his face. But then, because of socialist realism, because of the forced nature of that doctrine, he cannot abandon it. He is now completely wedded to it. He has to do it for the rest of his life. So I'm going to invite our young musicians to play Khachaturian's trio today, and please welcome them. I'm just going to say a few words. So we have here Jeremy Weinstein, who is on the violin, who is still an undergrad, and he is reading physics and natural sciences at Cambridge. We have Mark Zhang on the piano, who is a postgraduate composer at Cambridge, and Madeleine Morris, who is in Oxford and doing musicology as a postgraduate student on the clarinet. And I'll just say a couple of words about the trio, because while it's a strange, it's not quite a piano trio, normal arrangement. It doesn't have a cello, even though you can see that Khachaturian himself was a cellist. But it's because he wants to represent this Transcaucasian ensemble of duduk, kemancha, and the dole, the drums. So the piano actually very often will be doing something percussive and rhythmic to support the two soloists, who are going to sort of to do this very improvisatory music for us. It's beautiful music. It's sometimes smacks of Scheherazade, at times. It has very spicy, very tasty harmonies, doesn't it? Very jazzy harmonies, which everything is excused because it's folk music. So thank you very much for your attention. I will let you give you this floor now. I think Kitchener probably could have worked a little bit on the ending, you know, if he was aware, of the socialist realism already when he was writing that. He could have made it, louder and actually not going away, but rather more brighter. But well, I think that was a lovely illustration.
Thank you very much for a tremendous evening.
Thank you very much, Simon.